interesting that God would say this. Deuteronomy chapter 28 tonight, and look with me at verse number 1. In Deuteronomy 28 and verse number 1. And it says, "And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth." Now again, he's talking to the children of Israel here. It's very clearly, he says that. But I want you to notice what he says in verse number 1. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to hearken unto my commandments. What does that mean? It means I want you to obey and do what I tell you to do. Now, if you obey me, children of Israel, here's the rewards. Look at verse number 12. "And the Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, to the heaven, to give the rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thine hand." Notice what he says next, again, as a blessing of obedience. He says, "And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow." You see that? The whole reason that you're in debt in the first place is because you weren't being obedient to the Lord. Now, that's not in every case, but I would say that's probably true for 90% of the cases out there. What I'm trying to say to you is that you need to realize that there's a cause and effect, okay? And the cause is disobedience, and the effect is debt. He clearly says here, if you're going to heed to me and listen to my words and obey my commandments, here's one of the ways in which I will bless you. I will get you to the point where you will lend the money, and you will not have to borrow any money at all. See, if you want to cut debt completely out of your life, then the Bible clearly says here to us tonight, obey the Lord. Obey the Lord, and he will bless you with the ability to never have to borrow money at all. But look at the flip side of this in Deuteronomy 28, and look at verse number 43. "The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. And he shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. And he shall be the head over thou, and thou shalt be the tail. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded thee." So we see the flip side of this, just the exact opposite. God says, look, if you're not going to hearken unto me, and you're not going to listen to me, then guess what? Thou shalt not lend to him, he shall lend to thee. You're going to be borrowing money. Debt is going to be an issue if you are not going to obey. So we look at this and we say contentment is the first thing that you need to learn. Contentment is key when it comes to getting out of debt. Not only that, but then we need to move into the idea of realizing that we need to pay off this debt. We need to work it off no matter how big it is. Okay? If it's $80,000, if it's $100,000, if it's $10,000, that is money that you borrowed and money you need to repay. If that means you need to work and labor and pick up a second job, and maybe your wife has to pick up a job for a while or something like that, I would say that's well worth it to get my family out of the bondage of debt. Amen? Let me give you some practical advice on this. We'll move through this quickly. Number one, pray for God's help. Okay, number one, if you found yourself in debt, in trouble, you need to pray for God's help. Pray for God's wisdom, pray for God's guidance, pray for his provision. Amen? Okay? Commit it to God, and he will help you. Number two, communicate with those who you owe. The worst thing you can do is when you get the phone call from the debt collector is not call them back. That is the absolute worst thing you can do. If you communicate with them, really, debt collectors have a bad name, but I found in my experience in dealing with people and helping people is that if you communicate with those people who you owe money to, for the most part, they are reasonable people. If you say, look, you know what, I'm just not able to pay, is there any way I could just send you like $50 a month for the next year until I can get myself in a position to pay you more? They'll often work with you, so long as you're communicating. But the minute that you stop calling them or returning their phone calls or whatever the case is, guess what? That's when they start to get worried, that's when they start to get scared, and that's when they send it off to a legal analyst and all of those things. But as long as you're communicating with them, things will probably, for the most part, go smoothly. Not only should you communicate with those who you owe money to, but also you need to negotiate with those who you owe. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes you can call them up on the phone and say, look, I've the last year on this, and you've racked up so many fees and penalties on this whole thing. Is there any way you could knock down some of those fees and penalties? And you know what? I've literally helped people and seen companies knock down all the fees and penalties and even the interest rate on their debt. And all you have to do is just pay the principal back. These people are basically in a situation, these businesses, particularly now with the economy, where they're just happy to get a zero return on their investment because they're not going to get a negative return on their investment. So they're looking at it like that. So if you call them and say, you know what, over the last year I've racked up, $5,000 in penalties or something like that, really oftentimes they'll knock all of those penalties off, and even the interest rates and increased interest rates and fees and all of that stuff. Oftentimes they'll just knock that right down. And you could probably even negotiate with them on some of the principal. And I think there's still an issue there. If you did borrow the money, you need to repay that money. So negotiating the principal is a little sketchy there. But negotiate with them. A lot of people, even when it comes to medical expenses, a lot of people just go to the doctor and they get the bill. Do you realize that hospitals automatically charge you as if you were an insurance company? And do you know that they charge more to an insurance company because of all the paperwork and all the fees that go along with it? The cost of, let's say, an MRI is probably $10,000 to an insurance company, and if you were to pay for it yourself in cash, it's about $3,000. Okay? They charge insurance companies so much more for the same services. All you have to do is get on the phone with the hospital and say, I had to go in, I broke my arm, I got a $5,000 bill here. You know that most of the time you can get 2/3 of that taken right off. They'll say, oh, you know what, we are charging you insurance rates on that, on this, insurance rates on that. If you go to the doctor, do not pay the bill that they send you. Get on the phone with the accounts receivable and say, hey, I don't have insurance. I'm going to be upfront with you. I don't have insurance. What can we do about this bill? And literally, I would be surprised if you didn't see at least 50% of that bill completely knocked totally down. Okay? So negotiate with those people who you owe money to. Don't just take the bill that you get and pay it. Okay? You need to pay the bill, don't get me wrong, but don't just take it and pay what they're asking you to pay. Get on the phone and negotiate down the cost and say, I'm not an insurance company, I don't have insurance, I know you're charging $10,000 for this MRI, what can you do for me? And they'll say, oh, well, we've got a special rate for people who don't have insurance, it's $3,500. Okay? And oftentimes you can set up payment arrangements with the hospital. I mean, literally, I've seen people go into $30,000 medical debt, and then they don't call the hospital, and they don't do anything with the hospital. They get scared and they stop returning the calls. So the hospital sends it off to the debt collector. Well, guess what? Once the hospital sends it off to the debt collector, they've already written the debt off. Now the debt belongs to this new debt collector. You're not going to negotiate that price down now. It is what it is. Okay? Whereas if you would have just called the hospital the moment you got the bill, communicated with them, told them your situation, you probably could have got that $30,000 knocked down to $10,000. Literally. Okay? But there's a lot of people who don't know that. So be wise when it comes to that. Communicate and negotiate. Those are the two things you need to remember. Communicate and negotiate when you have a debt that you can't pay. Number one, pray. Committed to prayer. Then communicate and negotiate. And here's the last one. Seek advice, counsel. And I should say it there, seek godly advice and counsel. It amazes me the places that even Christians will go to get counsel. Well, I talked to my beer-guzzling brother-in-law and asked him if he had a church out there we could look at. And it's like, why do you ask somebody like that something spiritual? Obviously, they're not concerned about spiritual things. Ask a deacon in the church if you can sit down with them and say, hey, I need some counsel on my debt. How can you help? Ask the pastor. I'm certainly willing and available to sit down with anybody and help you work through your debt. I can help you communicate. I can help you negotiate with these debt situations that you have. But you got to get good godly counsel. Okay? And so if you found yourself in debt here tonight, I hope that this helps. Look at some of the practices when it comes to biblical debt, and then things to avoid, and then if we found ourselves in debt, how we can begin to climb out of that debt. Now, I wish that I had an easy answer for you. I wish I had a get-rich-quick scheme tonight to help you to get out of debt, but really it just boils down to simply learning to be content